In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can take your techno rumble bass to the next level and create these incredibly satisfying rumble sounds like this one. But I will also show you why most electronic music producers accidentally ruin their techno rumble bass and how you can avoid this one crucial mistake in your productions. So get ready for the ultimate techno rumble tutorial and make sure to stick around till the end of this video because I'm going to reveal my favorite mixing technique for kick and bass in a techno and electronic music context. My name is Philipp from Pick Yourself. I produce, mix and master music full-time in my Berlin-based studio, and the only reason this channel exists is because I want to share some of the lessons that I've learned with you and hopefully help you get to better results. Now, if you struggle with finishing songs, I have a free gift for you. It's called the Finisher Framework. You can get it at pickyourself.com/framework. The link is also in the description. And this is my 3 simple steps that will help you finish at least one great sounding song per month. That's a wonderful goal to have, and I think it makes total sense to commit to this. So in this session, I've created 3 different techno rumbles for you. They get more complex with each one, but also much more satisfying and better sounding. The first one is my favorite quick and dirty way to create a techno rumble. Let me show you how this is done. So techno rumble 1 sounds like this. And as you can hear, it provides a really stable low end. It is perfectly in sync with the kick drum. Now I will walk you through how to set this up. Let me first of all start with a word of warning, because there are so many YouTube tutorials out there on creating techno rumble bass that will give you the following advice. You create a kick drum, then you put tons of reverb on the kick drum, print the result, reverse this one, and use this reversed reverb kick drum as your rumble bass, and maybe then use a little bit of sidechain compression on top of that. Now the problem here is that this will create a very undefined, very muddy low end in the end, and it will create a lot of problems later down in the mixing stage. So what I will show you here is a more defined and more punchy way of creating a low end that actually moves rhythmically in a good way. So I've created a new channel here that's called Rumble Example. And now I will record the kick drum just in its raw form. You have to click here and select the kick drum channel as your source. And then you can also monitor this, post effects, and even when you solo this, you're going to hear the kick drum. Okay, let's record this quickly. So now we have the kick drum, and now it's time to work with it. So what do we want to achieve here? We want to create a sub-rumble that supports the kick. So the kick is supposed to cut through, create this punch, and the sub-rumble is supposed to give us this foundational, super nice low-end swell that comes in rhythmically. So first of all, we need to get rid of a lot of top end, because right now it's sounding like this, with this enabled. Much better already, so you can hear that this is working. It's in a very good rhythmical relationship. Now let's take it to the next level and actually create a rumble out of this. Step 2 is to add some reverb. Now my favorite tool inside of Ableton Live is this hybrid reverb. I absolutely love this. And you can go to some of the bigger spaces or some of the plates. Yeah, sometimes also these made for drums and chambers and large rooms can be interesting. But bigger spaces is my favorite for this. Arena hall, for example, or a cathedral. All of this sounds really good. Now I have this set to 100% wet because I actually want to create this source of reverb. What I also did is I flipped the bass to mono and I increased the stereo width a tiny bit. Now you have to be careful with this. If you overdo this, then you will get phase problems pretty easily. So I'm really conservative, just a little bit, 120, and then the bass to mono. And then let's add some saturation on top. The saturator now creates this texture and smear that we want on the low end for our techno sub-rumble. The question is, how far do you want to push it? Sometimes it's better to leave it a little bit cleaner. Sometimes you actually want a lot of that noisy texture. This depends on your specific song. The problem that we now have is that everything is just very smeary and we don't get enough rhythmical information. And this is why I'm adding an LFO tool. Here you can also use Shaperbox or something similar. You can also mimic this with Gain plugin and then automating the gain here. So this is also possible inside of Ableton natively. I just like this for ease of use. Now we have added in a little bit of our rhythm, and by the way, you can also decrease the wet dry on the reverb a little bit to have more of that original pump in here. And the last step is to decide how much top end you actually want in your sub rumble. So right now it's sounding relatively bright. Listen to this. And so I have decided against too much top end in my rumble. I want this stable low end, but I want all of the punch and impact coming from the kick. Now this sounds pretty freaking good already, so the question is, how can you take your rumble to the next level? And now the trick that I'm about to show you is so simple, but gives you a lot of benefits. My pro tip for better techno rumble bass is to use a different kick sample as the source of the rumble. Now, why is that beneficial? This little trick actually solves a very specific problem that most electronic music producers run into when trying to create their techno rumble bass. They create the rumble, they add it in with their kick drum, and suddenly the impact and low end punch of the kick is completely missing. They just hear massive rumble and a little bit of click of the kick on top of it. Now this is something that we don't want. We want the speaker, especially in the club, to produce that bass energy in the kick and then follow up with the rumble. The issue here has to do with phase cancellation. If the rumble signal comes from the same source as the kick signal, they are inherently very similar in terms of frequency content. They are tuned to the same frequency. The overtones are really similar. Now, of course, you run it through the effects chain and so on, but still it means that the source material was very similar, and this makes it very likely to cause phase issues if you don't pay close attention on where to place things. So how do we solve this in our second rumble? So in our level 2 rumble, we have the exact same effects chain, but what is different about it is the source signal. So I've recorded a different kick drum and reversed it, and the one that I picked sounds relatively spacious, relatively subby, and has more texture to begin with compared to the original one. Now let me solo this for you. So this is our new rumble here. Now compare this to the other one here. So to me, this immediately qualifies more for a rumble source than the original kick drum, and it creates nice contrast between the kick sample and the rumble sample. Let's listen to this in context now. I will show you the level 1 rumble and then the level 2 rumble. I hope you could hear how much more defined the low end now sounds. I really like the contrast between the kick and the rumble. It makes much more sense. How do we now get to our level 3 techno rumble, which I believe sounds incredible? The trick here is to create an audio effects rack with 2 different layers. The sub layer, which is exactly what we've had in our level 2 rumble, and the texture layer, which originates from the original backwards playing sample. So our sub layer sounds like this. Now our texture layer sounds like this. So how did I set this up? First of all, I created an auto filter. So this sounds like this. And I've used a little bit of an LFO that moves this filter frequency around. The type of filter that I've used was this bandpass, basically rejecting the bands here and only focusing on this band. And I used a little bit of drive, so I'm using OSR filter. I really think that this sounds incredible. It adds a little bit of texture already, and it gets rid of a lot of frequencies that we just don't want outside of this. Next up, we have an echo, and this is really important. I'm a big fan of dotted echoes, so dotted eighths and dotted fourths. This is playing in stereo at 70%. Now you could theoretically make this a little bit wider and use the internal reverb, but instead I used once again the hybrid reverb. So the echo sounds like this. And the reason this is so interesting is because the auto filter is feeding different frequencies, depending on where the LFO is set, into this echo. The echo on its own adds a little bit of a backbeat. Now if you combine this with a hybrid reverb, it sounds like this. And the reason this sounds so interesting is because I've used a short spring reverb, and what this does is it creates this little ringing artifact on top of that. And I really love it because it sounds so different from the original sub rumble and adds this nice tonal texture to it. Now you can also use cleaner reverbs, but I would overall go for shorter rooms, not something super massive. Therefore you will get the benefits of early reflections that please and tickle the ears, so it's a little bit of ear candy. Next up we add a little bit of saturation and a vocoder. And as you can see here, this formant setting is moving. This is because I've mapped this LFO to here. I only do a little bit of modulation, and what this does is it gives, once again, like a slightly evolving different texture. You can make this even more complex by adding this random waveform here instead of a sine wave. Now this is jumping around like crazy. So depending on what you want your texture to sound like, you can either make it more complex or less complex. I personally like this like evolving, slow LFO type of feel to it. Now, why do I have a glue compressor here? This is outside of this effects chain. This is actually after both of the effects chains, like the sub layer and the texture layer, and this is gluing it together. This is what the glue compressor does best. Take a look here. Relatively gentle attack time, not super fast, but also not super slow. Faster release time and ratio of 4:1. Let's add the other layer back in. So I really like what the glue compressor does. It not only glues the signal together, but it also moves rhythmically, even without using any sidechaining. It's just the way that I've dialed this in. And now let's talk about mixing kick and bass together. So at the beginning of this video, I've promised you that I will share with you a mixing secret, something that I would do as a professional mixing and mastering engineer to a low end of kick and sub rumble. Now, here's the bad news. I will not do much. I will not show you something super complex here because that's exactly the mistake that most people do. In so many tutorials out there, you would get advice like this. You group kick and bass together, then you use multiband compression on top of it to control the low end and the high end differently, then also use a little bit of multiband saturation to saturate the two differently, and then the chain goes on and on. The problem here is that this will create a muddy and undefined low end, and here's why. My philosophy on this is you want to give the speaker the clearest information possible to work with. Now, if you use a multiband tool in this context and group kick and bass together, what it does is it mashes everything together and then rips it apart by separating into separate bands and then letting those bands work differently. This destroys the groove, it takes away from the impact, and also it increases unwanted distortion and potentially even phase issues depending on how good your multiband tool is. So I'm a big believer in keeping the kick and the sub rumble separated and do it until the very last stage of the production process, which is the final mixing and maybe mastering stage. And the only thing I would then do is maybe glue everything, like the whole thing, together on the mix bus. So here's a quick tip on how to do this. So we are here on our master channel, and what I would like to do here is to use really slow attack time, fast release time, and a gentle ratio. And now we lower the threshold until the needle is moving just a tiny bit. So this is a very basic way of gluing kick and bass together in your final mix bus processing. Now I will do a dedicated video on mix bus processing. Let me know in the comments what you would like to learn about this topic. I'm happy to help you with anything you throw at me. Now that you've learned how to create amazing sounding techno rumbles, I highly recommend this video over here on how to layer kick drums effectively, because this is going to be a game changer for how your kick drum sounds. And I will see you in the next video.